So hello everyone at home and welcome to an episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host Carl Smallwood and today we're talking about Marvin Heemeyer, architect of the Killdozer. Before we get to the meat and potatoes of today's video, which is the awesomely named Killdozer, band name calling it, give a shout out to the author of this piece, Ben Edelman, who you can follow at the social media links below. And while you're down there, why not give the channel a follow, a like and comment with some feedback suggestions for future videos. So that I've been asked to say because analytics show that me asking people to do those three things means they're more likely to happen, which means we make more money and can keep making more videos, and I can just sit in my house drinking coffee, talking about a guy who built a giant bulletproof bulldozer and rampage through a town, which is awesome. On the morning of June 4th, 2004, Granby, Colorado was no different from hundreds of other small towns all across the United States. It was a kind of idyllic little mountain town you moved to in order to get away from the crime and chaos of big cities like the neighbouring Denver. By the end of the day, on June 4th, Granby looked like it had been through a war zone, with buildings destroyed, trees ripped up, streetlights and fire hydrants knocked over. You might be forgiven for thinking the cause of this municipal damage was some sort of natural disaster, but the truth was so much more bizarre. A bulldozer modified with armour plating to make it impervious to gunfire, and indeed, virtually all forms of conventional damage, has spent the afternoon driving around, deliberately crashing into things. The man at the controls of the machine, nicknamed the Killdozer, again band name calling it, was well known to the townspeople of Granby. Marvin Heemeyer was one of their neighbours, a local business owner who had lots of friends, was also infamous for his well-publicised disputes with the local town government. Few people had recognised the simmering anger beneath Heemeyer's skin that he'd apparently been holding onto for years, until he finally emerged with a suicidal plan to get revenge on anyone he'd felt had ever wronged him. Many people, even his own victims, were left in awe at the sheer audacity of his attack, including the time, effort and resource that went into building such an infernal contraption in the first place. Marvin has been held up as a hero in the years since his rampage by many, particularly among anti-government types who view him as a good person who finally snapped after being pushed too far by the man. The truth, however, is far more sad, that Heemeyer was a successful man who became consumed with perceived slights and petty grievances made against him, until he became so consumed with rage that he threw away everything he'd ever worked for in a rampage that was just as much about self-destruction as it was about, well, the regular kind of destruction. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We should start, as we often do, at the beginning. Marvin John Heemeyer decided soon after he was born in 1951 that he wasn't cut out for life on a South Dakota farm. Like many farm boys, he got out by joining the military, in Heemeyer's case, the Air Force, where he mostly worked as a clerk. Though his tour of duty would take him to exotic locales like West Germany, what really stuck with him was a stint at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado. He fell in love with the mountains and decided to make his home there after being discharged. While admittedly not great at what you would call that fancy book learning stuff, Heemeyer was good at working with his hands, able to pick up most trades fairly quickly. In particular, welding. After working at a couple of muffler repair shops in the Denver area, he decided to go into business for himself, and by all accounts he was quite successful. So successful that by 1989 he was able to retire to the mountain town of Grand Lake, a 100-mile drive to the northwest of Denver. In order to get to Grand Lake, which sits on the western edge of the Rocky Mountain National Park, you have to drive on US Route 40 through the town of Granby. Granby is the largest town in Grand County, though with a population of 2,000, that isn't really saying much. It is typical of most small crossroads towns that dot the Rocky Mountains. Most people pass through Granby on their way to somewhere else, in particular the National Park to the northeast, or the Hughes Ski Resorts and Winter Park to the south, or Steamboat Springs in the northwest. It's not easy living in the mountains with its long, frigid winters and short, cool summers. Many Granby residents can trace their history back to the first settlers in the area in the 1860s, but it does also attract its fair share of newcomers too. People who like the outdoors, people who find city life stifling and want to get away from it all, or those who can't quite fit in with the people around them. People like Marvin Heemeyer. Heemeyer first came to the attention of the citizens of Granby in 1992 when he purchased a 2-acre business property being sold at auction along with other assets at the failed Middle Park Bank. Initially intending to lease the property to a friend, he eventually decided to just keep it for himself and open up a muffler repair business. Just like with his earlier ventures, this business was quite successful, in no small part because Heemeyer, known to his friends as Marv, was considered to be an exceptional welder. Marv was somewhat less skilled, however, navigating the municipal authorities that govern the town of Granby. His first run-in came soon after purchasing the property regarding the sewage system, or rather the lack of a sewage system. The property's toilets were flushed directly into an old concrete mixing bowl buried in the ground, considered neither legal nor altogether sanitary. Heemeyer wanted to connect to the town's sewer lines, but that would require the installation of 100 feet of sewage pipe, as well as a lift station pump, since the sewage would need to be pumped upwards to connect to the line. And for anyone curious about the cost of such a project, it was reported that it would have cost anywhere between $50,000 and $75,000, and that Marvin would have had to absorb all of the cost. He refused, claiming that the town should pay for it, which the town thought was absurd. It's his property and their sewage line after all. Perhaps in an attempt at diplomacy, town official did note that Heemeyer could just install a septic tank on the property, which would be cheaper, but he refused to do that too. Eventually the town decided to just leave the issue alone, hoping it would sort itself out, because eventually Heemeyer would have to do something about the poop, right? In the meantime, another issue came along that turned normally boring meetings at Granby Town Hall into hotly contested affairs. So in 1997, a Granby businessman named Cody Dochef announced plans to build a concrete production plant on the lot adjacent to Heemeyer's business. Heemeyer was publicly opposed to this project and did successfully manage to rally many other neighbours who objected to the noise, dust and heavy commercial traffic that would naturally come along with the building of a concrete plant. The debate dragged on for years, culminating in Heemeyer suing both Dochef and the town itself, claiming that the proposed plant would harm his business, in spite of the fact that several alterations had been made to satisfy his many initial concerns. People who had been initially allied with Heemeyer did turn against him when it came out that prior to submitting their proposal, Dochef had attempted to purchase Heemeyer's property, only to have Marv continually rebuff and then raise the price from $250,000, then to $375,000, and finally to $450,000. When Dochef rejected what he thought was an exorbitant price for such a property, Heemeyer then announced that he'd campaign against the plant. Heemeyer's former allies started thinking that Marv was motivated more by personal vendetta and monetary gain than any real legitimate concern about its effects on the town. The concrete plant was eventually approved by the town committee in 2000, with only Marvin objecting to its construction. Heemeyer's lawsuit was eventually dismissed by a municipal judge, putting him on the hook for more than $50,000 in court costs and attorney's fees. At the same time, his sewer problems at his business weren't going away, as poop is want to do when you don't have sewage pipe to flush it down, after his neighbours complained that Marv was just dumping his sewage into an irrigation ditch that they owned, which was not great. Granby municipal authorities finally told Marvin that he needed to get a proper waste disposal system installed or he would be fined, for all the poop he was dumping. This was easily done because the Dochefs had actually offered him a free easement to hook onto the sewer system that they were installing at their concrete plant if he agreed to drop his lawsuit, but Marvin refused, almost daring Granby to fine him, which they eventually did. By this point, Heemeyer had become convinced that the entire town of Granby was being run by a good old boys network that was working together in a conspiracy to destroy his business. And while sitting in his hot tub one day in January 2001, Heemeyer said he'd had a revelation from God that he needed to get revenge on everyone that had screwed him over in Granby. And he had an idea on just how he was going to do it. Dun dun dun! Killdozer time. No, it's not. He's got to build it first. By the summer of 2002, after his lawsuits had been dismissed and he was battling down over the sewage system, Heemeyer closed down his business, announcing he was going to auction off all his equipment and leave town. But while he was doing this, he also travelled to an equipment auction in California and paid some $16,000 for a huge 60-ton bulldozer made by the Japanese company Komatsu. Marv moved the bulldozer into a large steel shed, concealing what he was doing from the world. He installed security cameras around the shed so that he could see what was happening outside. Eventually, moved into the shed full time, sleeping on a cot and going to the bathroom in a bucket so that he could spend more time working on the bulldozer. If only he had a working sewage system, which slowly but surely over the course of 18 months was transforming into a tank. A killdozer, if you will. Now, Marvin Heemeyer didn't exactly fit the stereotypical profile of the lone wolf rampager. He had lots of friends in both Grand Lake and Granby, particularly the crew that he went snowmobile riding with up in the mountains at least once a week. In spite of how much he claimed he was being destroyed by Granby and his residents, he actually came out ahead when he started selling his property to a trash company for 10 times what he paid for it a decade before. Sure, he wasn't married and he didn't have kids, but by all accounts, he had many girlfriends. His friends claimed that there was nothing he wouldn't do to help you if you needed it. They had a hard time understanding why he ended up doing what he did, and formed the core of his defenders after June 4th, 2004. But there was another side to Marv that his friends weren't familiar with, but his business associates absolutely were. Their statements reveal a man who was deeply distrustful of other people when it came to money. He was almost always convinced that anyone he did business with was out to cheat him, and was prone to overreacting, even to the point of trying to cheat them first. He even resorted to threatening people he's involved in business disputes with to bully them into paying up, though he had no run-ins with the law on his record when he was, Killdozer in it all up. It appeared that Heemeyer took really any perceived slight or insult against him, whether it actually happened or not, and internalized it, allowing rage to build up inside of him like a pot filled with boiling water, and at some point he allowed it to drive his actions until the only thing that mattered to him was getting an outlet for his anger by getting back at his enemies. So there's been a lot of speculation about Heemeyer's mental state prior to his rampage, but this stewing in rage and grievance lines up with the mindset of many other men who've committed rampage-style crimes, including those who bring guns to the workplace and murder their co-workers. And also, like many other rampagers, Heemeyer seemed to realise in the weeks prior to June 4th that his mission, for lack of a better term, was a suicidal one. He systematically gave away almost all of his wealth and possessions to family and friends, including his home. At 2 PM on June 4th, 2004, Marv Heemeyer crashed through the wall of the shed at the controls of his bulldozer, which now looked like something out of a science fiction movie a la Mad Max. His first port of call was Cody DeChef's concrete plant, and he began destroying it, crashing into walls and pillars before backing out and moving on to another section to crash into it again. Plant workers fled for their lives and the building began to collapse, some barely escaping in time. Speaking of kinda cool, that some of the workers, led by DeChef himself, actually attempted to disable the bulldozer by jamming steel bars into the gears of the tread. It didn't work, but it looked awesome. Then DeChef decided to just fire upon the machine with a pistol, the first of more than 200 rounds which we expended that day. And again, this had no effect, but just the image of a guy defending his business from a bulletproof 85-ton bulldozer by hitting it with a stick and then shooting a gun at it is too rad. And if I was that guy, I would have made that just, when I reopen that concrete plant, that would just be the image outside I'd have. Just a picture, this is how much I care about my business. Like, pew, pew, pew. Take that, Killdozer. But yeah, as mentioned, the bullets had no effect, and nobody knew it at the time, but Heemeyer had spent a year and a half systematically welding 2 layers of half-inch thick steel plates all over the driver's cab and the engine compartments. He then filled the 4-inch gap between the plates with concrete, making the machine, which afterwards would earn the admittedly awesome moniker of the Killdozer, almost impervious to all outside attack. And for anyone thinking, well, surely this thing had a weak point, right? What about windows? Well, it didn't have windows either, because Marv had similarly blocked those up and instead rigged up 5 video cameras to the outside of the bulldozer, which you might think, okay, so they're a weak point, right? You can get the cameras, then he's blind. But no, he thought about that and covered the covers to the cameras in bulletproof plexiglass so he could see where he was going and nobody could stop him from doing so. DeChef even tried to ram into the bulldozer with a front end loader and only succeeded in knocking himself unconscious in the process, while the Killdozer just continued on its merry way. Police officers began to arrive on the scene pretty shortly thereafter, because reports of a giant bulldozer destroying everything tends to attract police attention. And this included Grand County's sheriff deputies and the Colorado State Patrolman, but none of them could figure out how to stop the bulldozer either. Under Sheriff Glenn Trainer, who took command of the scene, initially thought that the machine might have been radio controlled, at least until it started shooting at him and his officers. Heemeyer, as it turned out, had built 3 gun ports into the front, back and side of his creation, and periodically would stop moving to just fire pot shots at the cops attempting to stop him. His deadliest weapon, besides the Killdozer itself though, was a Barrett M82 50 caliber sniper rifle that cost Heemeyer some $7,000. And anyone who's played Call of Duty knows what this thing can do, but for anyone that was unfamiliar with the capability of the Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle, it's usually referred to as a anti-material rifle, and it's normally used to attack things like armoured personnel carriers or soldiers who were hiding inside of bunkers. Having thoroughly destroyed the concrete plant, the bulldozer then headed southeast into Granby proper, next attacking the officers of Mountain Park's electrical company, then the Maple Street builders, all while police officers followed along, trying desperately to figure out a way to stop the rampage before somebody got hurt or worse, killed. It was quickly decided to take advantage of the reverse 911 system to notify every resident of Granby to evacuate their homes, with special attention paid to anyone who'd ever had past run-ins with Marvin Heemeyer, who by this point was already suspected as being the driver. Under Sheriff Trainer had climbed onto the top of the armour-plated bulldozer by this point, firing his handgun down into what looked like an exhaust port to no effect. After noticing that his attacks were having no effect, Trainer jumped off the Killdozer as Heemeyer drove his homemade tank towards Granby Town Hall, where most of the contentious meetings between Heemeyer and the town board had taken place. It was also home to the town's library, where several children were awaiting the start of story hour. Library workers did manage to evacuate the children just in time, and the entire building was demolished, including heavy damage to the library. By now, understandably, the rampage was attracting attention from outside of Granby. News helicopters from Denver arrived on the scene and filmed the destruction in real time. And much of this news footage does exist online, and you can follow pretty much the entirety of the thing in YouTube videos. And the police helicopters at the time were having a lot of trouble trying to follow the action themselves because they had to keep jockeying for space with news helicopters, who understandably didn't want to not film this because it's kind of a story that people want to follow, but still, something needs to be done to stop this thing. So on the topic of stopping the Killdozer, the police, who possessed no weapons capable of even breaching the bulldozer's defences, asked for the Colorado National Guard to be called in. And while you might think trying to call in the National Guard would have been the first port of call, it was something that had to go through official channels. In this case, the Governor, Bill Owens, who would later report that he seriously considered calling in an Apache attack helicopter armed with anti-tank missiles to take out the Killdozer, but was persuaded not to when he realised that shooting anti-tank missiles into a small town might cause civilian casualties. So all while this was happening, Heemeyer ran the bulldozer into several more buildings, some vehicles, some trees, a few light fixtures. Liberty Savings Bank and Sky High News both sustained heavy damage in the process. Heemeyer then went after one of the chief targets of his rage, the Thompson family, who owned an excavation company in town and whose patriarch, Ron, had once served as Granby's mayor. The Killdozer did heavy damage to several Thompson properties, including the home of Ron's 82-year-old widow, Thelma, who was fortunately evacuated prior to the arrival of the Killdozer. Marv then drove into a storage yard of independent propane, which had an estimated 75,000 gallons of liquid propane stored in huge tanks. Heemeyer then decided to significantly up the stakes by shooting at the tanks with his .50 caliber rifle, using incendiary rounds, which he was apparently allowed to have, to try and puncture and ignite the propane, which would have resulted in a massive explosion that experts would later conclude would have vaporized everyone within a 1,000-yard radius, including the occupants of a senior citizens' home that police were scrambling to evacuate. Fortunately for the people in that senior citizens' home, Heemeyer had over-engineered the machine, and the scraper on the back could not be loud enough to give the rifle a clear field of fire, and ended up shooting at his own armour instead of the propane tank. After traversing pretty much the entire length of Granby, the Killdozer now left the propane farm and headed west back to town. During this time, two huge scrapers operated by Grand County had done battle with the Killdozer, trying to stop it to no avail. The armour plating added an additional 25 tons of bulk to the machine, giving it a total weight of some 85 tons, which was more than enough weight and power to simply push the scrapers aside. Back in town, Heemeyer bulldozed Gamble's general store, completely flattening it. But this is where Marv's luck ran out, because the right tread got stuck in a basement in the rear of Gamble's that he didn't know about, and he was unable to free it. At the same time, coolant had burst out of a hose in the engine compartment, a sign the block was reaching the point of overheating. And even if he got out of the basement, he couldn't operate for much longer anyway, and after 2 hours of destruction, Marv shut the engine off. At this point, SWAT teams swarmed around the machine trying to find a way, any way inside, when a pop was heard from inside. None of them knew it at the time, but it was over. Heemeyer had shot himself in the head with a handgun. It took hours for the police to figure out a way to even get inside the Killdozer. 3 explosive charges failed to even dent the armor plating, so a cutting torch was used to slice a hole in the steel casing, and everyone moved with caution due to the very real fear that the machine had been rigged to explode or had booby traps built into its armor plating. Fortunately, there were none of either. Early the next morning, they finally breached the bulldozer's cab and discovered Marv Heemeyer's lifeless body. And many rampagers commit their acts wearing, mall ninja tier tactical gear or dressed all in black to try and intimidate and scare people. But Marvin had gone to battle for the final time wearing a brightly coloured Hawaiian shirt. It was just one more absurdity to add on top of an already very strange day. And it's been so hard not to Miraculously, Marvin Heemeyer was the only casualty of the events of June 4th, 2004. Nobody else was killed or even seriously injured, though there were some close calls. The people who jumped on top of it to try and stop it, for example. The property damage, on the other hand, was enormous. 7 businesses were either totally destroyed or heavily damaged to the point they had to be flattened and rebuilt. And this is alongside the town hall building, a few private residences, some streetlights, fire hydrants, trees, several vehicles, and the town's playground equipment. The guy, he attacked the playground. What a And the total cost to public and private property, after all was said and done, was estimated to total in at some $10 million. Granby, Colorado found itself at the center of the nation's media coverage for about 24 hours. I'm thinking, well, this sounds like a big deal. Why was it not covered for longer than 24 hours? And that's because the very next day, former President Ronald Reagan died and the bulldozer rampage almost completely disappeared off the front page. Granby, meanwhile, attempts to move on from the destruction. They built a new town hall, a new library, while the private businesses affected had varying levels of difficulty getting opened back up depending on insurance payout. As for what happened to Marv Heemeyer, his body was taken, cremated, and his ashes were scattered by his friends up the mountains as part of a snowmobile ride, the kind he'd enjoyed prior to his rampage. As for the Killdozer, well, that was kept mostly intact for about a year, while the debate raged on about what to actually do with it. And there were some proposals which ranged from the comedic to the completely sincere to the establishing of an annual Dozer Day in Granby to commemorate the event and attract tourists, keeping the machine as kind of a monument to the whole thing, which just... Okay, no one died, but it seems in poor taste to lionize a guy who tried to commit an act of mass murder on an entire town. And thankfully, cooler, more sensible heads prevailed and the machine was scrapped and the pieces sent to various scrapyards to discourage souvenir hunting by weirdos who collect memorabilia for potential mass murderers. In the years following Heemeyer's rampage, he has become kind of a cult hero in certain communities on the internet. The ones that people don't like to talk about or go to. These fans, mainly anti-government types, completely believe Marv's story about there being a small-town conspiracy to destroy him, despite virtually all evidence to the contrary. They even embellish upon the story he himself would tell, claiming that the concrete plant blocked road access to Heemeyer's business, or that the town deliberately disconnected him from the sewer line and then fined him for it, both of which are demonstrably false. The point, it appears, is to portray Marvin Heemeyer as a good man who was simply pushed too far by a corrupt government, so had no choice to do what he did. They point to the fact there were no other fatalities that day other than his own as evidence that he didn't really want to hurt anyone, even though realistically there was no way for him to know whether or not the buildings he was crashing into in his 85-ton purpose-built Killdozer had people in them. Also, the whole taking pot shots at propane tanks with incendiary rounds from a giant sniper rifle thing. Kind of, all over that theory. At best, Heemeyer simply didn't care if he killed anyone during his rampage, or at worst, he was actively trying to take as many people with him as he could. Others, though, are simply amazed at the level of dedication and craftsmanship it took to build the Killdozer in the first place, which, admittedly, it's pretty impressive that just a random dude built something that the combined might of, an entire police force and with backup from all manner of extra services couldn't even stop, let alone. Admittedly, it is kind of impressive that one dude with a couple $1,000s and some know-how managed to build something that was, for all intents and purposes, completely unstoppable. And even among Heemeyer's intended victims, few people can find it within themselves to hate him. Mostly they just feel sorry for him, and it's not hard, as easy as it is to make fun of him as some kind of weirdo crackpot, which I'm absolutely doing right now, the story of Marv Heemeyer is ultimately a very sad one. It's a man who had what most people think of as a pretty good life, yet he still couldn't figure out a way to be happy with what he had. Instead, he became so consumed with what he believed other people owed him, what he thought they'd done to him, that he went completely over the edge and an entire town suffered as a result. And I hope everybody watching at home found this video informative, entertaining, and educational. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things. The script, as mentioned, was written by Ben Edelman. Follow them and myself on social media at the links below. And also, while you're down there, why not like the video, leave some comments with feedback or suggestions for other things we could cover, subscribe for more videos like this, and as I always like to say, go out there and have the day you all deserve.